At my wedding, I saw my sister pour something into my champagne when no one was looking. I swapped our glasses. When she raised the toast, I smiled. Then it began. The air in the bridal boutique was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive floor wax, a combination that usually made me feel successful. But today it just felt like a lack of oxygen. I stood on a circular pedestal of mahogany, surrounded by three-way mirrors that reflected every angle of my apprehension. The gown was a masterwork of ivory silk and hand-stitched lace. A $10,000 armor designed to make me feel invincible. For a brief, flickering moment, I looked at my reflection and saw a woman who had finally won. I was 29 years old, a marketing director who could navigate a crisis in a boardroom without breaking a sweat. And I was about to marry into one of the oldest names in Charleston. I was Nevaeh, and I was supposed to be happy. But then the door chime rang, a cheerful silver sound that heralded my destruction. Sutton drifted in, her phone already held at eye level to capture the aesthetic of the room for her 12,000 followers. She did not look at me. She looked at the screen version of me. She wore yoga pants that cost more than a month of groceries and a designer handbag she had no way of affording. Her presence was a cold draft in a warm room. Behind her, like shadows tethered to her heels, came our parents, Conrad and Blythe. I watched through the mirror as my mother immediately went to Sutton, smoothing a stray blonde hair from her forehead, as if Sutton were the one standing in a wedding dress. My father stood by the door, his arms crossed, his face set in that mask of quiet disappointment he had worn since I was 6 years old. It was the face he made whenever I achieved something he could not attribute to his own influence. "I should be your maid of honor," Sutton announced, not bothering with a greeting. She stepped into my frame, blocking the view of my own train. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, a phantom heat that always rose when she was near. It was the memory of a fire from 20 years ago, a small blaze in the garage started by a curious girl with a box of matches. Sutton had held the matches, but I had held the blame. My parents had looked at her tears, and then at my silence, and decided that I was the one strong enough to carry the guilt. I had been carrying it ever since. "I already asked Adeline," I said, my voice steady despite the hammering in my pulse. "She is my best friend, Sutton. She has been there for every promotion, every late night, every step of this journey." Sutton wrinkled her nose as if she had smelled something rotting. "Adeline wears pantsuits to everything, Nevaeh. Do you really want her in the society pages standing next to you? Think about the brand. Think about what Sterling's family will say if your own flesh and blood is pushed to the side. It will look like we are estranged." I looked at my mother, hoping for a sliver of support, but Blythe was already dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "Oh, Nevaeh, sweetheart," she whispered, stepping onto the pedestal to take my hands. "Sutton is absolutely devastated. She feels like you do not love her. Your sister is going through such a difficult time with her finances, and she just needs to feel valued." "It is one day," my father added, his voice a heavy gavel. "Surely you can be generous for one day. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. Indulge her." The manipulation was a well-oiled machine. They were asking me to be the shock absorber again, to let Sutton lean on me until my spine snapped. I looked at the three of them, a closed circle that I was perpetually outside of, and the word tasted like ash in my mouth. "Fine," I said. "She can be the maid of honor." Sutton squealed, a high, performative sound that she likely hoped her phone had captured. My mother beamed, and my father gave a sharp, approving nod. The tension in the room dissipated for them, but for me, it settled into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I realized then that I was not a bride to them. I was a stagehand in the play of Sutton's life. As they began to discuss the lighting for the reception, and how many photos Sutton would need for her grid. I looked back at my reflection. The $10,000 dress was still beautiful, but I felt the first real cracks in my lie. I had believed that if I reached the pinnacle of success, if I married the right man and wore the right silk, they would finally see me. Instead, they had simply found a bigger stage for my sister to stand on. I did not know then that this was only the beginning of Sutton's plan, or that my silent agreement in that boutique had paved the way for a vial of colorless liquid and a ruined cake. I only knew that the heat was rising, and for the first time in 29 years, I was tired of being the one who didn't burn. The weeks following the dress fitting felt less like a countdown to a celebration, and more like the slow tightening of a noose. I was sitting in my office at the firm, the window overlooking the gray steeples of Charleston, trying to focus on a regional marketing campaign that required my total attention. But my focus was fractured. Every few minutes, my phone would buzz with a new demand from Sutton. The most recent notification was an invoice for a $1,800 silk bridesmaid gown. She had not consulted me on the designer or the cut. She had simply gone to a boutique that required private appointments and served vintage champagne, then sent me the bill as if it were a foregone conclusion. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the transfer button. I could afford it. My career as a marketing director had provided me with a comfortable cushion, but it was the principle that felt like a hot needle under my skin. I was paying for the privilege of being undermined. I looked at the other open tab on my laptop. The final contract for our wedding cake. $8,500. It was a staggering amount for flour and sugar. A 6-tier red velvet masterpiece, wrapped in gold leaf. But it was the one thing I had chosen for myself. It was a symbol of the height I had reached. A sharp knock at my office door startled me, and before I could answer, Sutton sauntered in. She did not look like someone who was $51,000 in credit card debt. She looked like a woman who owned the city. She dropped her designer bag onto my mahogany desk and leaned over my shoulder, squinting at my monitor. $8,500 for a cake, Nevaeh. She laughed, a brittle, mocking sound. You are trying so hard to buy your way into Sterling's world. Do you really think a fancy cake is going to make his mother forget where you came from? Old money can smell new effort a mile away. I closed the laptop lid with a snap. I am not buying my way into anything, Sutton. I am paying for a wedding that reflects our success. And speaking of paying, I just saw the invoice for your dress. $1,800 is twice the budget we agreed upon for the bridal party. Sutton waved a manicured hand, as if swatting away a fly. We cannot look cheap in the society pages. What would Sterling's family think if the maid of honor looked like she shopped at a department store? I am doing this for your reputation as much as mine. Besides, I am a little short this month. My engagement metrics are down, and the brands are being slow with their payouts. She began pacing my office, touching the awards on my shelves with a dismissive air. You have always been the responsible one. The one with the spreadsheets and the promotions. You can handle a little extra on the credit card. It is not like you do not have it. The resentment flared in my throat. It was not about the money. It was about the fact that she had never once asked. She only ever took. I watched her pull her phone out and begin filming a story for her followers. Pouting at the camera and tagging the hotel. She was building a digital fantasy on the foundation of my labor. I reached for my phone to transfer the funds. My heart heavy with the weight of the lie I told myself every day. I told myself that if I just kept the peace, if I just absorbed the cost of her chaos, the wedding would go off without a hitch. But as I scrolled through my notifications, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Sutton had left her phone unlocked on my desk for a split second to check her reflection in the window. A notification from an online forum popped up on her screen. The subject line read, "Fast-acting sedatives for high-stress events." I froze. I wanted to reach out and grab the phone, to scroll through the thread and see what she was researching. But she turned back too quickly, snatching the device and tucking it into her pocket with a sharp, guarded look. "What are you staring at?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "Nothing," I lied, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. "Just thinking about the seating chart." She gave me a long, searching look before smirking. "Good. Make sure I am next to Sterling's brother. I need the networking." When she left, the office felt unnervingly silent. The shadow of that notification lingered in the air like a poisonous mist. My logical brain tried to dismiss it. Perhaps she was just anxious. Perhaps she was looking for something to help her sleep. But the hyper-vigilance I had developed over 29 years of being her scapegoat told me otherwise. Sutton did not take pills to calm herself. She took actions to destabilize others. I looked back at the cake contract, the red velvet tiers and the gold leaf. It was supposed to be the centerpiece of my new life. Now, it felt like a target. I realized then that my perfection was not a shield. It was an invitation for her to see how much she could break. I picked up my phone and dialed Adeline. I did not tell her about the money or the dress. I told her that I needed her to be my eyes. I told her that the girl who held the matches 20 years ago was looking for a new fire to start. I was no longer just a bride. I was a strategist, and for the first time, I was playing a game where the stakes were my very soul. The transfer for the dress went through with a soft chime, a digital surrender that felt like the first step toward a declaration of war. The night of the rehearsal dinner arrived with a heavy, humid heat that seemed to cling to the moss-draped oaks of the historic estate. I stood on the veranda, watching the fireflies dance against the darkening sky, but I felt none of the romantic whimsy a bride should experience on the eve of her wedding. Instead, I felt like a sentry on a high wall, watching the horizon for an invading army. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming jasmine, scents that usually anchored me to Charleston, but tonight they felt suffocating. Inside the dining hall, the sounds of silver clinking against fine china and the low hum of prestigious conversation created a symphony of high society grace. Sterling was in the center of it, his laughter easy and genuine as he spoke with his colleagues. He looked so safe. He looked like a man who had never had to sleep with one eye open to protect his belongings from his own blood. Sutton was already at work. She had cornered a group of Sterling's younger cousins, her wine glass held high, as she leaned in to share a secret. I could see the way her lips moved, the way she widened her eyes in a practiced show of mock confidentiality. I caught snippets of her voice as I moved through the room. She was talking about my wild side in college, spinning a narrative of a sister who was far less stable than she appeared. It was a calculated strike at my reputation, a way to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of my new family before the vows were even exchanged. I felt a hand on my arm and turned to find Adeline. Her face was grim, her eyes scanning the room with the professional intensity of a woman who spent her days cross-examining liars. She leaned in close, her voice a low murmur that barely rose above the ambient noise. "We need to talk in the garden," she said. "Now." We stepped out into the shadows of the manicured hedges, away from the glow of the chandeliers. The transition from the warm light to the cool dark made my skin prickle. Adeline did not waste time. She pulled her phone from her clutch and showed me a photograph. It was a blurry shot of the interior of Sutton's designer handbag, taken while Sutton had been in the powder room. Tucked between a compact and a lipstick was a small glass vial with a white dropper cap. It is a fast-acting liquid sedative, concentrated, Adeline whispered. I recognized the label from a case I handled last year. In high doses, it does more than just help you sleep. It creates profound disorientation, slurred speech, and loss of motor control. If someone takes enough of it, they look like they are in the middle of a total alcoholic blackout. My heart performed a slow, painful thud against my ribs. The paranoia that had been simmering in my office 2 weeks ago finally boiled over into a terrifying certainty. Sutton was not just looking to embarrass me. She was looking to chemically erase me. She wanted the society pages to see a drunken, stumbling bride who was a liability to the prestigious Ashford name. What do we do? I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and a burgeoning, cold rage. Adeline took my hands, her grip steadying. We do not react. Not yet. She is waiting for you to confront her so she can play the victim and turn your parents against you. If you accuse her now, you are the crazy one. We have to let her believe she is winning. I looked back through the French doors at my sister. She was laughing now, her head tilted back. The picture of a supportive maid of honor. She looked so innocent, so fragile. It was the same look she had worn 20 years ago, when she pointed the finger at me, while the garage burned. I realized in that moment that the lie I had lived by was dead. Being perfect would not save me. Being indispensable would not earn their love. Sutton did not want my seat at the table. She wanted to burn the table down, while I was still sitting at it. A strange, icy calm began to settle over me. It was the mindset of a marketing director facing a total brand collapse. I stopped being a victim and started being a strategist. I began to map out the geography of the head table for the next day. I thought about the lighting, the seating chart, and the identical crystal flutes that would be used for the toast. I would not pour the liquid away. I would not run to my parents. I would let the girl who loved matches play with fire one last time. I returned to the dining hall with a smile that was as sharp as a razor. I found Sterling and leaned into his side, soaking in his warmth as if it were a shield. When Sutton eventually approached us, her eyes glittering with hidden malice, I did not flinch. I greeted her with a sisterly warmth that was a total fabrication. I was no longer the shock absorber. I was the mirror. I was going to show Sutton exactly what she was, and I was going to use her own poison to do it. The night ended with a toast to the future, but as I raised my glass, I was already looking at the end of our past. I was ready for the red velvet. I was ready for the truth. And for the first time in my life, I was not afraid of the fire. The morning of the wedding arrived with a clarity that felt almost violent. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the hotel suite, illuminating every grain of dust and every loose thread. I sat in the makeup chair, a captive to the ritual of transformation, while a team of artists worked to paint the mask of a perfect bride onto my skin. The air was a thick haze of hairspray and expensive perfume, punctuated by the rhythmic clicking of a photographer's camera. I felt strangely dissociated, as if I were watching a high-budget film starring someone who looked exactly like me. Sutton was everywhere. She flitted between the bridesmaids, directing the lighting and insisting on retaking every group shot where her chin did not look sufficiently sculpted. She wore a silk robe that I had paid for, sipping coffee I had ordered, while managing her digital empire from the palm of her hand. She did not look like a woman who had spent the previous night researching sedatives. She looked radiant, energized by the proximity of Sterling's wealth. When it was time to dress, the weight of the silk and lace felt like lead. As my mother buttoned the long row of tiny pearls down my spine, she whispered about how proud she was of my poise. But I knew she was not proud of me. She was proud of the reflection. I was the bridge to a social standing she had craved for 30 years. The walk to the altar was a blur of white roses and expectant faces. The historic church was a cathedral of old Charleston prestige, its air cool and smelling of ancient wood. I felt the gaze of 300 people on me. But my focus was narrow. I looked at Sterling, standing at the end of the aisle in his tailored tuxedo. He was my anchor, the only thing in this room that felt real. But even as I approached him, my eyes flickered to Sutton, standing in her $1,800 dress, her hand resting lightly on the small clutch that I knew contained my downfall. We exchanged vows in voices that sounded steady to the room, but my heart was a frantic bird against my ribs. Sterling took my hand, his grip warm and grounding. When he spoke of reconstructing what was broken and building a life on the truth, I felt a sharp, agonizing pang of grief for the woman I used to be. I was no longer the daughter who took the blame to keep the peace. I was a woman about to commit a silent, necessary act of war. As we walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, the organ music swelling to a triumphant roar, I saw Sutton smile. It was wide, bright, and utterly predatory. She was already looking past the ceremony to the reception, to the head table, to the moment she would slip that vial from her bag. She thought she was watching the beginning of my end. I allowed the dissociation to keep me steady as we transitioned to the hotel ballroom for the reception. I watched the staff arrange the identical crystal flutes. I noted the position of the $8,500 cake, its gold leaf shimmering under the chandeliers like a silent witness. The trap was set, but it was not mine. Sutton had built the cage. I was simply going to ensure she was the one who walked inside. By the time we sat down for the first course, my fear had hardened into a cold, clinical resolve. I looked at the champagne bubbles rising in my glass and realized that the lie was finally over. I was no longer afraid of what my family would think. I was only waiting for the music to start. The hotel ballroom was a cathedral of light and sound. But for me, the world had narrowed down to the 6 square inches of silk tablecloth directly in front of my chair. The scent of herb-crusted lamb and expensive vintage wine filled the air, yet my mouth was dry, tasting only of metal and anticipation. I sat at the head table, my body angled toward Sterling in a pose of bridal devotion that I had calculated weeks in advance. To the 200 guests watching us, I was a vision of serene success. To myself, I was a clock spring wound so tight that I feared my own heartbeat might snap me in two. Sterling leaned in, his breath warm against my ear, as he whispered a joke about his uncle's questionable dance moves. I forced a laugh, the sound bright and hollow, while my peripheral vision stayed locked on the movement to my right. Sutton was a blur of champagne, colored silk and practiced grace. I felt her shift. I felt the air change as she reached across the small gap between us. It was a movement so fluid, so helpful, as if she were merely straightening my place card. But in the reflection of a silver spoon, I saw the ghost of a vial in her palm. I saw the colorless drop fall, a silent liquid weight that vanished instantly into the golden bubbles of my champagne. My phone, resting face up on the table, gave a single, sharp buzz. The screen illuminated the dim space between my hand and the glass. It was a message from Adeline, sitting just 20 feet away. 5 words in all capital letters that felt like a physical strike to my chest. Swap glasses. She drugged it. The confirmation should have been a shock, but instead, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. The hyper-vigilance of 9 years had prepared me for this exact moment of betrayal. My pulse, which had been erratic, suddenly smoothed into a rhythmic, cold determination. I was no longer Nevaeh the victim. I was the marketing director managing a catastrophic breach of contract. I needed a distraction, a gap in Sutton's predatory focus. And then, fate provided the ultimate diversion in the form of Mrs. Eleanor Ashford. the matriarch of the family, stepped out from the VIP lounge. Her navy silk gown shimmering with the quiet authority of 10 generations of wealth. The click of her heels on the hardwood floor was a countdown. I felt Sutton stiffen beside me. To my sister, Mrs. Eleanor was not a person. She was a gatekeeper to the life Sutton desperately craved. As the older woman passed behind our chairs, Sutton practically leaped from her seat. She turned her back to the table completely, her voice rising an octave into a syrupy, manufactured tone as she began gushing over the beating of the matriarch's Oscar de la Renta gown. This was the window. This was the only 5 seconds I would ever have. My hands moved with a precision I did not know I possessed. I did not lift the crystal flutes. I knew the risk of a spill or a clink was too high. Instead, I applied a gentle, downward pressure to the bases of both glasses. I felt the friction of the heavy silk tablecloth, a soft resistance that allowed for total control. I pushed my drugged glass toward Sutton's place, setting while simultaneously pulling her clean glass toward mine. They glided across the fabric like two pieces on a chessboard, silent and inevitable. The entire motion took 4 seconds. I rotated her glass slightly to hide the faint trace of her lipstick on the rim, turning it toward the back of the table. By the time Mrs. Eleanor moved on with a polite, dismissive nod and Sutton dropped back into her chair, the world had been reordered. Sutton was flushed with the high of her social interaction, her eyes bright with the belief that she had just secured a position in the inner circle. She did not look at the glasses. Why would she? She was a master of her own reality, and in her reality, I was already defeated. She reached out, her fingers closing around the stem of the glass I had just moved into her path. "Let us toast to your happiness, Nevaeh," she said, her smile wide and poisonous. "To a night we will never forget." I raised the clean glass, my eyes meeting hers over the rim. For the first time in my life, I felt the power shift. The lie that had kept me small and silent for nearly 3 decades withered away in the heat of my new, icy clarity. "Thank you, sister," I replied, my voice as steady as a mountain. "May you get exactly what you have earned." The crystal flutes met with a clear, pure chime that seemed to ring out across the entire ballroom. Sutton drank deeply, her throat moving as she swallowed the very disorientation she had intended for me. I took a small, careful sip of the untainted wine and watched her. I watched the hunter swallow the bait. I watched the girl who loved fire pick up a burning coal. The toast was finished, the trap was sprung, and as the best man stood up to take the microphone, I realized that for the first time in 29 years, I was the one holding the matches. The applause for the best man's speech was still echoing through the ballroom when Sutton rose from her seat. I watched her with a clinical detachment that felt like a newfound superpower. She had drained the glass, every last drop of the vintage champagne, and the concentrated melatonin, and the chemistry of her betrayal was already beginning its work. As she stood, I saw her left hand brush the edge of the table, a subtle movement to steady herself as the floor began its first gentle tilt. She did not know it was the drug. She likely thought it was the adrenaline of her coming performance, or the heat of the 300 candles flickering in the crystal sconces. She began to walk toward the small stage area near the wedding cake, and I felt the entire room shift its focus toward her. The cake sat there like an ivory altar, 6 tiers of red velvet perfection that had cost $8,500. It was wrapped in gold leaf that shimmered under the chandeliers, a monument to the life I had built and the family she was trying to destroy. Sutton positioned herself right next to it, her champagne-colored silk gown catching the light. She wanted to be the centerpiece. She wanted the photos to show her as the golden sister against the backdrop of unimaginable wealth. "Good evening, everyone," she began. Her voice, amplified by the high-end sound system, was clear, but I caught the slight drag on the final syllable. I looked at Sterling. He was smiling, his hand still resting over mine, completely unaware that his bride was a different person than the one who had walked down the aisle 4 hours ago. I looked at my parents. My mother was beaming, her eyes filled with the reflected glory of her youngest daughter's spotlight. My father sat back with an expression of smug satisfaction. None of them saw the way Sutton's eyes were starting to glaze. None of them noticed the way her grip on the wireless microphone was tightening until her knuckles turned white. For those who do not know me, I am Sutton, she continued. Nevaeh's sister. And I have to say, it has been quite a journey watching her find someone worthy of her. There was a ripple of polite laughter, but the air in the room was growing heavy. I could feel the tension rising as Sutton paused, for a beat too long. She blinked rapidly, her eyelids moving like heavy velvet curtains. The drug was hitting her hard now. A tidal wave of disorientation that was stripping away her inhibitions and her motor control. She reached out with her free hand and touched the edge of the cake table, her fingers digging into the silk linen. Nevaeh has always been the perfect one, she said, her voice dropping into a register that was no longer sweet. The organized one. The one with the perfect career and the perfect husband from the perfect family. She swayed visibly. A murmur of concern rippled through the front tables. Sterling's mother, Eleanor, leaned forward, her brow furrowing. Sutton was supposed to be giving a toast, but her words were starting to bleed into one another. She looked directly at me, and for a split second, the mask slipped. I saw the raw, jagged envy that had fueled her entire existence. I saw the girl who had burned the garage 20 years ago and watched me take the fall. So, here is to Nevaeh, she slurred, raising her empty hand as if she still held the glass. To my perfect sister and her perfect life. May your marriage be everything mine will be someday. She tried to step back, to make a grand exit from the stage, but the floor was no longer there for her. Her equilibrium vanished in a single, catastrophic instant. I saw the exact moment her brain lost contact with her limbs. Her eyes rolled back slightly, and she pitched forward. There was no protective instinct, no reaching out of the arms to break the fall. She was dead weight, a falling star of champagne silk and concentrated malice. The sound of the impact was a dull, wet thud followed by the collective gasp of 200 people. Sutton did not hit the floor. She hit the cake. $8,500 of red velvet, and gold leaf exploded on contact. The 6 tiers collapsed like a controlled demolition, showering the stage in crimson crumbs and white buttercream. Sutton's face went first, buried deep into the 3rd tier, followed by her torso. The ivory stage was instantly transformed into a crime scene of sugar and sponge. The red velvet interior, a deep and vibrant crimson, smeared across her blonde hair and her $1,800 dress until she looked like she had been the victim of a violent assault. My mother's scream tore through the silence, a jagged sound that broke the spell of the ballroom. But it was Sterling who moved first. The doctor in him obliterated the husband, the guest, and the socialite. He was on that stage in 3 seconds, his tuxedo jacket discarded as he dropped into the wreckage of the cake. Someone cut the music, he commanded. His voice a whip, crack that silenced the jazz quartet. I stood at the head table, my hands resting on the white linen, watching as my husband rolled my sister onto her side. He was clearing her airway, wiping thick globs of red velvet, and frosting from her mouth with a linen napkin. The ballroom was a chaos of standing guests and hushed whispers, but I was the only one who saw the microphone. It was still clutched in Sutton's hand, lying right next to her lips on the frosting, covered floor. As Sterling tilted her head back, Sutton's eyes flickered open for a fraction of a second. She was in a state of synergistic toxicity, her mind a clouded soup of alcohol and sedative. She looked up at the chandeliers, then at Sterling, and then she spoke. Her voice was weak, a rasping whisper. But the microphone was live, and the sound system broadcasted her confession to every corner of the room. "Wrong glass," she whimpered. The words echoing through the speakers like a death knell. The drug glass. It was supposed to be hers. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so heavy that I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the hotel lobby. Every single guest, every member of the catering staff, and every member of Sterling's prestigious family had heard it. The truth had finally caught up to the girl with the matches. I looked at my father, who was frozen halfway to the stage, and my mother, who had her hand pressed to her mouth. The lie was dead. The golden child had confessed in a ballroom of frosting and blood-red cake, and for the first time in 29 years, I was the only one in the room who was truly clean. The echoes of the live microphone died away, but the weight of the silence that followed was crushing. Sutton lay in the ruins of the red velvet cake, a smear of crimson sponge across her face, while the reality of her confession rippled through the ballroom like a shockwave. I stood at the head table, my hands trembling ever so slightly as I looked down at the woman who had spent 2 decades trying to burn my life down. The smell of the buttercream frosting, once sweet and celebratory, now felt cloying and sickly, thick with the scent of a dying reputation. Sterling did not look at me. His focus remained entirely clinical, his fingers pressed against the pulse point in Sutton's neck as his eyes scanned the room for his medical bag. His face was a mask of professional granite, but I could see the tension in his jaw. The man who dedicated his life to healing was now looking at the person who had tried to poison his wife on their wedding day. "I won't call the police tonight," Sterling said, his voice cutting through the hushed murmurs of the 300 guests. He looked up at my parents, who had finally reached the edge of the stage. "But do not mistake my silence for forgiveness. This is a synergistic toxicity. Alcohol and a central nervous system depressant. These are classic symptoms of a sedative overdose. She needs a stomach pump and a toxicology screen." My mother made a small, choking sound. "No," she whispered, her hands fluttering toward her chest. "She would never. She was just overwhelmed, Sterling." She felt left out. She made a mistake. The old Nevaeh would have felt a pang of pity. She would have reached out to comfort the woman who had spent 29 years making excuses for the golden child. But that woman had died the moment I watched the liquid drop into my glass. I looked at my mother and saw her for the first time without the filter of obligation. She was not a protector, she was an accomplice. Sterling stood up, his height dwarfing my father, as he pulled his phone from his pocket. He dialed 911 with the calm precision of a surgeon, his voice steady as he gave the dispatcher the medical details. Behind him, the 6-tier cake lay in pieces, $8,500 of artistry, reduced to a heap of evidence. My father tried to step forward, his face flushed with the familiar mask of authoritative indignation. "This is ridiculous," Conrad said, his voice booming in an attempt to reclaim control of the room. "We will handle this as a family. There is no need for sirens. There is no need for a scene. You are 30 years too late to handle anything," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. He did not yell. He did not have to. The authority of his name and his profession was absolute. "You two will go to the hospital with her. And if I ever hear of a single attempt to blame Nevaeh for what happened tonight, I will ensure that the audio recording of that microphone is played in open court." The threat hit my father like a physical blow. He actually stepped back, his mouth hanging open as he looked at the son-in-law he had so desperately wanted to impress. For the first time in his life, his status and his demands meant nothing. He was just a man standing in a mess of frosting, holding the wreckage of his favorite daughter. The ambulance arrived with a staccato of blue and red lights that flashed against the ballroom windows. The paramedics moved in with practiced efficiency, loading Sutton onto a gurney. Her champagne-colored silk dress was ruined, a dark stain of red velvet seeping into the fabric like a deep wound. My mother followed them out, her head bowed as she passed the whispering clusters of Sterling's family. My father lingered for a second, looking back at me with a gaze that was heavy with accusation and fear. I did not look away. I did not apologize. I stood with Adeline and Sterling and watched him disappear into the night. Adeline discreetly handed the empty vial she had secured from the head table after the fall to Sterling, who tucked it away as medical evidence. The ballroom was a wasteland. The old money. Guests were already making their exits, their faces tight with social discomfort. The dream of the perfect society wedding had been replaced by the reality of a family's rot. But as I looked at the hotel manager, who was wringing his hands near the bar, I felt a lightness that I had never known. "Clean it up," I said, my voice clear and certain. "Bring out more wine and whatever desserts the hotel has in the kitchen." The manager blinked in surprise. "You want to continue?" "This is my wedding," I told him, looking at Sterling, who was finally walking back toward me. "And I am going to celebrate it with the people who actually care about me." Sterling reached me, taking my hands in his. His tuxedo was stained with frosting, and his hair was disheveled. But he had never looked more handsome. He didn't ask if I was okay. He knew the answer. He saw the fire had finally stopped burning me and started warming me. We stayed for another 2 hours. We danced to the jazz quartet, we laughed with Adeline and David, and we ate lemon tarts while sitting on the edge of the stage. The $8,500 cake was gone, but the cage was gone too. I had spent 29 years paying a debt I did not owe. Tonight, the account was settled. I looked at my new husband and realized that the best money I ever spent wasn't on the silk or the gold leaf. It was the price of a ruined cake that finally bought me my freedom. The morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our hotel suite felt different than it had a year ago. It was no longer a harsh spotlight, revealing the dust of my anxieties, but a warm, gold embrace that filled the corners of a life I had built on my own terms. I sat in a rocker, the rhythmic creak of the wood against the floor, the only sound in the quiet room. I was 8 months pregnant, and my daughter was a restless weight beneath my ribs, her small kicks a constant reminder of the future we were protecting. My phone buzzed on the side table. It was a new device with a new number. But some ghosts still find a way to knock. A text message from a mutual acquaintance relayed a plea from my mother. It was the same tired script. She spoke of family ties and the tragedy of a grandmother being kept from her grandchild. She claimed Sutton had finally found herself, and that the past should stay in the past. I read the words with a detachment that was almost peaceful. The old Nevaeh, the one who lived in the shadow of the fire, would have felt the familiar pull of the guilt. She would have wondered if she was being too harsh, if the $8,500 was a small price to pay for a peace that was actually just a slow surrender. But that version of me had been buried under a mountain of red velvet and buttercream. I thought of Sutton, still living a virtual life fueled by debts she could never repay. I thought of my parents, who still viewed my sister as a fragile orchid, and me as the iron fence that was supposed to keep the world from bruising her. They had not changed. They had only grown more desperate as their audience dwindled. I did not reply. I did not feel anger or even the hot spark of revenge. I simply felt finished. I selected the contact and hit the block button, a digital seal on a door that I would never open again. I did the same for the others, one by one. I cut the threads of toxicity until the only sound left was the steady breathing of my husband in the next room. Sterling walked in a few moments later, carrying 2 cups of tea. He saw the phone in my hand and the quiet look on my face. He did not have to ask. He sat at my feet, resting his hand on the curve of my belly. "You okay?" he asked softly. "I am better than okay," I said, and I meant it. I am free. We had made a promise to each other in the months after the wedding. We talked about the kind of home we wanted to create, a place where there would be no golden child and no scapegoat. Every child would be seen. Every child would be heard. No one would ever be asked to take the fall for another person's matches. Later that evening, I sat on the porch and opened my laptop. I looked at the online forum where I had once sought advice when the world felt like it was collapsing. I began to type a final update. I told them that the $8,500 was the best tuition I had ever paid. I also mentioned that Sutton had been forced into a long-term treatment facility by the threat of Sterling's recording, finally removing her shadow from my life. It was the cost of learning that self-worth is not a wage you earn from people who do not value you. It was the price of realizing that a ruined cake can be the foundation of a beautiful life. I closed the lid and watched the sun set over the marshes of Charleston. The air was salty and clean, and carried the scent of the sea and the promise of a storm that would wash the dust away. My daughter kicked again, a firm little flutter against my hand. I whispered to her in the twilight, a promise that she would never have to earn her seat at our table. The monster was gone. The cage was open, and as the first stars began to blink in the velvet sky, I realized that I had finally, completely, come home.